January 17, 1943, a cold, biting wind cuts through the barren landscape of the Soviet Union. Snow falls in heavy sheets, obscuring the silhouette of a barbed wire fence that stretches endlessly across the horizon. The air smells of damp earth and the faint, acrid scent of burning wood. In the distance, the quiet thrum of engines from Soviet military trucks, their wheels grinding into the frozen mud, fills the stillness of the morning. Inside a makeshift barracks, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, the prisoners huddle together for warmth. Their faces are gaunt, hollow from months of starvation, their eyes sunken with fatigue. At the far end of the room, one woman stands apart from the others, a figure of quiet defiance in a sea of despair. Her tattered uniform hangs loosely on her slender frame, a reminder of the brutality she has endured since her capture. She glances toward the door as footsteps echo down the corridor. The officer has arrived. His boots strike the cold, hard floor with a rhythm that matches the steady beat of her heart. For a moment there is silence, a pregnant pause, filled with 1,000 unspoken words. Then as the door creaks open, she catches a glimpse of his face. He looks weary, the harsh lines of war etched into his features, yet there is something in his eyes. Something that, for a fleeting second, mirrors the same quiet desperation she feels. The room holds its breath. This is not just another day of captivity. This moment will change everything. The year is 1943, and the world is in the grip of the most devastating conflict humanity has ever known. The war is at its apex, and the global stage has already seen unimaginable destruction. For the German Wehrmacht, the Eastern Front has become a graveyard of ambition. After a series of early successes, the Germans now find themselves entangled in a brutal, grinding conflict with the Soviet Union. The Battle of Stalingrad, a pivotal turning point, ended just a few weeks before this moment in early January 1943. The Wehrmacht had suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing an entire army, the Sixth Army, to the encircling Soviet forces. The Germans, once confident of victory in the East, now face a desperate fight for survival. This is the backdrop for the prison camp where the woman, a captured enemy soldier, now resides. As Nazi Germany's reach across Eastern Europe collapses under Soviet counterattacks, hundreds of thousands of prisoners find themselves trapped in makeshift internment camps, designed more for deprivation and suffering than any semblance of order or care. The Nazis are ruthless in their treatment of prisoners of war, particularly Soviet soldiers, whom they regard with disdain as part of a larger ideological war against Bolshevism. These camps, located far behind the lines of the front, become hellish landscapes where survival is an act of resistance. The prisoner at the center of our story is one of many soldiers caught in this war, a woman who had been conscripted into service by the Soviet Union, like so many others forced to fight in the chaos of the Eastern Front. As the Germans advanced, she was captured in the early winter of 1942 during a failed Soviet counteroffensive. Now in this desolate camp, the days bleed into each other, marked only by the sounds of barking dogs, the clanging of metal, and the ever-present crackle of a distant war. The officer in question, a German lieutenant, a man still young but wearied by the relentless demands of the front, has his own story to tell. He was among the first to march into the Soviet Union in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Like most of his peers, he joined the Wehrmacht with a sense of duty and belief in the righteousness of his cause. But now, as the war drags on, that sense of purpose has begun to fray. The loss at Stalingrad, the bitter cold of winter, the endless casualties, it all weighs heavily on him. He no longer sees the war in terms of glory or victory, but in terms of survival and the unrelenting demands of his position. For both the prisoner and the officer, survival has become a matter of mere endurance, of weathering the storm of war with as much dignity as one can retain. Their lives, once so far apart, now converge in the confines of this camp, a place that is less a prison and more a purgatory of human endurance. But as with all moments of human conflict, there is room for the unexpected. In the crucible of this suffering, where both captor and captive are worn down by the harsh realities of the war, something begins to shift. Neither side could anticipate the transformation that would come from a simple human act of kindness. By early 1943, the German army's grip on the Soviet Union had begun to loosen. The vastness of the Russian land, The fierce resistance of the Soviet forces and the unrelenting winter had all combined to create a near insurmountable challenge. The German soldiers, once confident in their swift and brutal march eastward, now found themselves caught in a war of attrition that drained their strength and morale. The myth of the invincible German war machine was crumbling, and with it, the once unshakable confidence of the officers. At the same time, the prisoners languishing in these camps began to experience the brutal realities of captivity. The Soviets, as well as the many soldiers from other nations who had fallen into German hands, were treated with a cruelty born of ideology. The German High Command, particularly under Hitler's brutal regime, viewed prisoners not as human beings, but as tools for propaganda, labor, and in many cases, mere objects of scorn. For the Germans, taking prisoners was a strategic necessity, but the treatment of those prisoners was rarely guided by any code of compassion. Hunger, disease, and brutality were the order of the day. In these camps, a hierarchy of suffering emerged. Soviet soldiers, especially women, were often given the worst conditions. The Nazis saw the Soviet Union as the heart of communism, and for them, the defeat of the USSR was not just a military objective, but a cultural and ideological necessity. To capture a Soviet soldier, especially a woman, was both a symbol of power and an opportunity to further humiliate and break the spirit of the enemy. Yet within the confines of this bleak reality, human interactions, though fleeting, still had the power to transcend the boundaries set by war. The officer in charge of the camp, a man like so many others who had been swept up in the larger tides of war, was not immune to the strange and often contradictory emotions that came with his role. As the war dragged on, some soldiers found themselves questioning the righteousness of their mission, the brutality of their actions, and the very nature of the conflict they were engaged in. For the prisoner, her circumstances were one of crushing isolation. She was far from her homeland, cut off from any support or means of escape. The psychological toll of captivity weighed heavily on her, and with each passing day, the small acts of kindness, whether from a fellow prisoner or an occasional German officer, became the only small sources of hope. She did not expect mercy, but the smallest gestures of humanity could sometimes shine through the darkness. It was in this environment of suffering and deprivation that the unexpected occurred. The officer, who had seen countless prisoners in the bleakest of conditions, began to notice something about this woman, something that set her apart from the others. Perhaps it was the quiet strength in her eyes, or the way she carried herself with a dignity that seemed untouched by the horrors surrounding her. Or maybe it was the haunting look of someone who had seen too much but refused to yield to despair. He, too, was trapped in a system that demanded brutality, a system that had no room for mercy or compassion. But in the shadows of the camp, where neither side could escape the weight of the war, the smallest act of kindness became a spark, a human connection that neither had anticipated. Neither had expected to find any semblance of humanity or solace in such a place. But in the brief moments when their eyes met across the barren camp, something began to change. These moments of contact, these fleeting interactions, would come to mean far more than either could have ever imagined. They would become a silent rebellion against the dehumanizing forces of war, a small testament to the enduring power of kindness, even in the darkest of times. For the female prisoner, the experience of captivity was a daily battle of the mind. The body could endure hunger, the cold, and the relentless work, but the mind was a more fragile thing. As a Soviet soldier, she had been trained for battle, not for the hardships of being a prisoner. The weight of loss and isolation bore heavily on her soul. Her comrades, captured alongside her, had been executed or slowly starved. Yet she had survived, perhaps by sheer will, or perhaps because, deep inside, she clung to the belief that survival itself was an act of defiance. For months, she had been in the same camp, her days indistinguishable from one another. Each morning she awoke to the same oppressive cold, the same sour taste of stale bread, and the same feeling of despair. But amidst all the suffering, she had learned to guard her emotions, to hide her true feelings behind a mask of stoicism. She had no choice. To show weakness was to invite further cruelty. Yet, there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, when she allowed herself to imagine a world beyond the barbed wire. When she caught a glimpse of the officer, she would momentarily think of her home in Russia, of the life she had left behind. In those brief instances, a part of her would wonder, would she ever be free again? Could a world ever exist outside of this madness? But she quickly dismissed these thoughts, for such dreams were dangerous in a place where even hope could be lethal. However, the officer's presence began to have an effect on her. His occasional glances, his tentative gestures of kindness, though brief, started to alter something deep within her. She had spent so much time seeing captors as faceless monsters, tools of an oppressive regime. But this officer, with his tired eyes and weary movements, began to blur that line between captor and human being. It was in these moments, when he lingered for just a fraction longer than necessary, or spoke in softer tones, that she felt the slightest glimmer of something that resembled empathy. For the first time since her capture, she began to question everything she had come to believe about her enemies. From a tactical perspective, the conditions of the prisoner of war camp were part of the greater strategy of psychological and physical warfare. In World War II, the treatment of prisoners varied widely, but the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front were notorious. The Germans, for their part, had little interest in maintaining the health or well-being of Soviet prisoners. The Nazis viewed the Soviet Union not just as a military adversary, but as an ideological enemy. The idea of a brutal, exhausting war of attrition was not only seen as a way to exhaust the Soviet forces, but also to undermine the very spirit of the Soviet people. Prisoners were often treated as expendable labor. In the camps, they were made to work under grueling conditions with little regard for their welfare. They were pushed to the edge of their physical and mental limits, enduring forced marches, starvation, and harsh punishments for even the smallest transgressions. For the officer, overseeing this was part of his job, and it was a job that he had been trained to carry out efficiently. He was not there to question the methods or morality of his superiors. He was there to enforce the rules, however cruel they may have been. But in a war where the human cost was so high, even officers found themselves questioning the ethics of what they were doing. When the officer interacted with a female prisoner, he was reminded of the humanity that still existed, even in the midst of war. The camp was an environment that dehumanized both captor and captive. Yet it was in this environment that the officer began to see the blurred lines between the roles of victim and oppressor. And as the months wore on, the psychological toll on him too began to show. On a broader scale, the logistics of prisoner of war camps were crucial to the functioning of the German war machine. Prisoners were often used as forced labor, sent to work in factories or to build infrastructure that supported the Nazi war effort. In the early years of the war, the Germans had employed the forced labor of prisoners to fuel their military and industrial ambitions. However, as the war progressed and resources became more strained, maintaining the camps and ensuring that the prisoners remained alive, enough to work became increasingly difficult. The officer in charge of the camp had to balance the demands of his superiors with the realities of camp life. The logistics of feeding and controlling prisoners was a constant challenge. The supply lines had become strained, particularly as the war in the East escalated, and food and supplies for the camps grew scarce. The prisoners, starved and exhausted, were forced to work long hours under the harshest conditions. In a way, the officer's role was not just one of control, but of managing the labor force that, whether he liked it or not, played a key role in sustaining the German war effort. However, what the officer could not control were the emotional and psychological impacts of the environment. Despite his efforts to maintain order, the stress and toll of war were evident in the way both the prisoners and their captors interacted with one another. A frail connection between the two could be as transformative as the supply lines themselves, one that defied the very purpose of the camps. At the heart of this story lies a moral question that transcends the war itself. How do individuals cope with being complicit in a system they don't fully believe in? The officer was part of a regime that viewed the Soviet Union as an ideological enemy, a force of tyranny that must be eradicated at all costs. This belief shaped every aspect of his actions, from the way he viewed prisoners to the way he carried out orders. But as the war dragged on, the moral justification for such brutality began to erode. The officer's interactions with the female prisoner forced him to confront this internal conflict. She was not just an enemy combatant, she was a person, someone who had experienced the same suffering as he had, someone who had been caught in the same storm of history. Over time, The officer's role as a mere enforcer of orders gave way to a more complicated reality. He began to see the prisoner not as an ideological enemy, but as a human being, a fellow survivor in an unfathomable war. For the prisoner, this moral shift was just as profound. She had come to view all Germans with hatred and suspicion. But as her days in the camp wore on, the officer's unexpected moments of kindness began to shift her perspective. She started to see him not as a faceless enemy, but as someone trapped within the same system, a system that was determined to destroy both of them. Their shared experience of suffering under the same war brought them to an unexpected moral crossroads. The realization that war, in its purest form, was a betrayal of the human spirit. It was late February, a bitter evening in the deep winter of 1943. The snow, now a permanent feature of the camp, had transformed the barracks and watchtowers into an unforgiving white wilderness. The cold penetrated through every crack in the walls, every gap in the poorly stitched uniforms. Prisoners were bundled together in tight corners, their breath visible in the icy air. The usual sounds of the camp echoed across the snow-covered ground, the barking of dogs, the clinking of chains, the murmur of voices too soft to catch, but laden with the weight of exhaustion. On this evening, the officer made his rounds, his boots crunching through the snow as he moved through the row of barracks. His face was drawn, eyes heavy with the toll of both war and his role within it. But tonight something had changed in him. There was an unease in his movements, something more than the usual fatigue of his position. He had grown accustomed to the daily brutality of the camp, the silent suffering of the prisoners. Yet tonight, as he passed the barracks where the female prisoner resided, he hesitated. She stood by the window, her face pale but alert, her eyes catching his for a split second. An unspoken moment shared between two people who were not supposed to have any common ground. Earlier that day, something unexpected had happened. In the middle of the harsh labor details, a group of prisoners had been punished for a minor infraction, one that was as much a result of the ever-present hunger and exhaustion as it was a defiance of the oppressive system. The officer had been the one to carry out the punishment. It was brutal, and the event weighed heavily on him, more so than any other incident in recent months. But as the prisoners were forced back into the barracks, one among them, a young woman, had collapsed in the cold. It was then that the officer, in a moment of hesitation, ordered her to be carried back to the barracks for medical attention. It was a small act, hardly significant in the grand scope of the war, but it was a break from the mechanical cruelty that had defined his existence up until that point. When he entered the barracks later that evening, it was the woman who caught his gaze. This time, however, something unspoken passed between them. She gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging the kindness he had shown earlier. There were no words, only an exchange of understanding, and in that moment, the officer felt something stir within him, something long buried beneath the layers of duty and ideology. The moment was fleeting, no more than a glance. But for both the officer and the prisoner, it was a turning point. A shift in perception that would alter the course of their lives, and perhaps their understanding of the war they were both trapped in. The officer's role in the system was clear, but this moment of humanity forced him to reckon with his complicity in the violence and suffering around him. For the prisoner, this act of kindness, small as it seemed, shattered the boundaries she had erected between herself and her captors. In the harsh, frozen wasteland of captivity, she saw in him not just an officer, but a man struggling with his own demons in the shadow of a war that had no winners, only survivors. The act was not without consequence. The officer was not naive. He knew that even the smallest deviation from the strict rules of the camp could result in punishment, perhaps even his own dismissal from his post. But in that fleeting moment, a crack had appeared in the armor of both of them. The system of war, which demanded unwavering allegiance to cruelty and order, had been momentarily disrupted by an act of unexpected humanity. Neither the officer nor the prisoner could undo the larger reality of their circumstances, but that moment of kindness, shared between captor and captive, would leave an indelible mark on both their souls. As the officer turned to leave, he looked back one last time. The woman was still standing at the window, watching him go. He did not know what would come of this, nor could he predict what might happen next. But the connection was made, and for both of them, the course of the war and their own futures was now forever altered. In the days that followed, The consequences of that fleeting moment between the officer and the prisoner began to ripple through the camp. The officer, once a mere enforcer of orders, found himself grappling with a silent unease that weighed heavier than the cold of the Russian winter. The camp's harsh routine continued unabated: labor, punishment, deprivation, but something within him had shifted. He no longer saw the prisoners simply as a faceless enemy to be controlled, but as individuals, each with their own story, each struggling to survive in a world that had abandoned them. His role as a guard and an officer now seemed impossibly distant from the humanity he had seen, however briefly, in the woman's eyes. He remained cautious. To show too much kindness was dangerous, both for him and for the prisoner. The camp was a place where discipline reigned supreme, and any signs of weakness, any deviation from the strict order, could be punished severely. The officer's hesitation, his decision to allow the prisoner medical treatment, had already raised eyebrows among his comrades. Whispers began to circulate. He was not the only one who had seen the toll the war was taking on the soldiers, but many of his peers viewed empathy as a dangerous luxury, something that could undermine the harsh, unforgiving structure of the camp. The woman, too, had felt the shift. Her days, though still marked by the same unyielding hardship, were colored by the subtle change in her perception of the officer. No longer was he just another embodiment of the brutal regime that had imprisoned her. He had become, for a brief moment, a symbol of something else, something fragile, something human. She could not afford to trust this feeling, not in a place where trust could get you killed, and yet each time she crossed paths with him, the briefest of glances between them was enough to remind her that, even in the darkest corners of the world, there was still a flicker of humanity. The camp continued its brutal, monotonous rhythm. The officer's small act of kindness did not go unnoticed by the other prisoners. Some whispered about the strange gesture, others simply watched, unsure of what to make of it. It became a subtle, fleeting symbol of defiance in a world that had long since forgotten the meaning of mercy. The female prisoner, though still far from free, began to see that even in the deepest pits of despair, there could be moments of grace, moments when humanity could still break through the impenetrable walls of war. As the weeks passed, the officer grew increasingly disillusioned. The weight of his actions and inaction began to gnaw at him. He found himself questioning the very nature of the conflict he was part of. What was the point of all this? To crush the spirit of an entire people? To wipe out the very essence of a nation? He had seen firsthand the horrors of war, the relentless destruction, and now, in the quiet moments with the prisoners, he began to see the faces behind the uniform. The faces of people, like him, caught in a machine they had no power to control. Yet, he remained a part of that machine. His duty, though corrupted by doubt, still bound him to the camp. His actions, however small, had not led to any grand rebellion or change. The camp continued to function as it always had. The war still raged on, and the brutal calculus of survival and victory governed all. But for the woman, there was no return to normalcy. The small kindnesses she had received were not enough to erase the scar of her captivity. She remained a prisoner, her future uncertain, her fate decided by forces beyond her control. Still, she had seen something different in the officer, a flicker of compassion that defied the ideology of the regime. It was not enough to free her from her chains, but it was enough to give her a new way of seeing the world. Even in the bleakest of places, humanity could still shine through, no matter how faintly. In the larger scope of the war, the repercussions of their interaction were negligible. The German war effort continued to falter on the Eastern Front, the Soviet forces pressing harder with each passing month. The prisoner, one among millions, would eventually be released or die in the icy hell of captivity. The officer, too, would continue to carry out his duties. His internal conflict slowly buried beneath the weight of his position, but in the quiet corners of that camp, where the winds howled across the snow-covered fields and the cries of prisoners echoed through the night, something had changed. The war, with all its grand narratives of victory and defeat, had never been about the struggle between nations alone. It was also about the small human moments that occurred between individuals, moments that had the power to alter the course of a life, if only for an instant. The prisoner, the officer, both were mere pawns in the vast, unrelenting machine of war. Yet in that fleeting moment, their shared humanity had breached the barriers built by ideology, power, and violence. In a place where survival was the only currency, where every day was a struggle to endure the next, The smallest gesture of kindness became an act of quiet rebellion against the overwhelming dehumanization that defined both sides of the conflict. The war, grand in its scale, catastrophic in its reach, had always been more than the clash of armies. It was, at its core, a war of ideas, a collision of ideologies that sought to reshape the world through destruction. Yet even in the heart of such violence, where lives were reduced to numbers and people to enemy lines, there remained an indomitable force, the ability to see beyond the uniform, beyond the role forced upon you, and to recognize the humanity of another. The officer, disillusioned by the brutality of his world, began to understand that his position as a soldier, a member of a monstrous machine, did not absolve him of his responsibility to those around him, whether friend or foe. And for the prisoner, trapped in a world of suffering and loss, that brief moment of empathy, though insufficient to change her fate, became a flicker of light in the darkness. It reminded her that even in a world torn apart by war, there was still the possibility for human connection, however fleeting, however fragile. Both of them, though their paths would diverge in the harsh, unyielding tides of war, were marked by the experience. The officer, perhaps, was left with the quiet, gnawing realization that he could no longer look at the prisoners as mere objects of control. The woman, too, carried within her the unspoken understanding that, despite the cruelty of the world around her, there was something more than just the struggle for survival. There was, at its heart, a struggle to retain one's humanity. War may break the body, but it cannot fully destroy the human spirit. In the midst of its horrors, in the most dire of circumstances, acts of kindness and recognition of shared suffering become powerful symbols of resilience, reminders that even in the darkest moments, there is a possibility for light, however faint. The soldier's uniform, the barbed wire, the lines drawn between captor and captive, they are nothing in comparison to the truth that war, in all its brutality, cannot entirely extinguish the heart's capacity for compassion. And as the war would continue to reshape the world, those small, quiet moments of humanity would echo through the lives of those who had experienced them, leaving behind a legacy that no battle could ever erase.